Alrighty, everyone. We are now joined by the one and only host of Connections. Let me try that again. Let me just do that again because I
No,
do
no
not want to
worries.
mess up the start of your podcast. Okay. And wait, it's drum. I don't say that any
Yep,
weird way,
it's
do I?
it's
Okay.
so no, my parents kept it real simple. It's just like
Love
everything in
it.
the dictionary, chase and drum, nothing complicated.
Perfect. Okay, everyone, we are now joined by the one and only host of the Grid Connections podcast, Chase Drum. Welcome to the Out of Spec podcast. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Francie. This is almost, let's say, a dream come true. Personally and professionally, I've been a long time listener and just big fan of the whole Out of Spec franchise, and it's so great to see the podcast that the team has launched and how you've just really led it and be such a great inspiration. And just, I guess, even personally speaking, not only is it a great and educational, entertaining podcast, it's almost it's great motivation every time I see you. I mean, I do a weekly podcast and I'm like, oh, I got to do all this editing. I got to do all this work. And then I feel like every other day you got something coming out. So maybe it's a friendly competition that every time I get annoyed with editing or something else, is like, well, you know what? I'm just doing one a week. And I feel like Francie's always just putting up a new one every day. So really honored to be here and big fan of the show.
Well, thank you for saying all those nice things. I do try to, make some quality content consistently on the regular to keep everyone electric and informed. But I would love to give our audience a little bit of insight into your Grid Connections podcast. Can you
Yeah.
tell me about how you got involved like in the podcasting world for EVs and what Grid Connections just likes to focus on?
Yeah, I think real quickly, I will give a kind of quick overview and background of myself, and then talk about Great Connections and now even what I call Bespoke EVs Consulting, which is another kind of side project. But yeah, I mean, personally, I've been playing around with and just nerding out about electric vehicles for over 2 decades now, which I had to like double check that I wrote that right. I was writing an article the other day and someone was like, why don't you do one finally on yourself? I do a lot of monthly articles for greencars.com. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll start writing about my background and how I got involved with it. And then I realized, yeah, I've been doing this over 2 decades, which just seems absurd since I think for most people, they don't even know of EVs maybe for like the last decade of that. But it all started really with my background of building and racing electric vehicles in high school. And from there, I just became completely fascinated with engineering and the efficiencies. And I don't get me wrong, just kind of like you, Kyle, and a lot of the other team, I'm also a big fan of combustion vehicles. I love all forms of transportation. But there was just so many kind of unique things about electric vehicles around their reliability, their efficiency, that really just always kind of gets my mind thinking about things and really being fascinated about it. And from there, I not only just got so into electric vehicles, I started just kind of exploring the other parts of what this really looks like. It's not the same infrastructure. It's not the same sphere of usability that we've seen from combustion vehicles and really the last century in the automotive space. So, kind of unintentionally, but my eyes opened again about a decade ago. I worked in the commercial solar industry. And then I saw, okay, this is connecting that other part of the piece. Like, how do you not only take these now electric vehicles, how do you fuel them? How do you make sure that they have the energy and do it in not only a sustainable, but even kind of closed loop situation, which is really cool. And doing it domestically. I mean, you can't have maybe, I don't know, maybe you're an oil baron in Texas if you're listening, but otherwise, the only way you can really have the full loop is with an electric vehicle and solar on your house or a windmill. And I just thought that kind of I don't know. It strikes all sorts of different things between just the how cool the technology is to almost kind of this Americana patriotic, being able to do this all yourself and kind of be self-sustaining and self-supporting. And I live on the West Coast, so you always love that whole Oregon Trail and making it out for your own kind of message. But from there, I just kind of learned more and even worked with some startups in the digital software and kind of marketing and automotive space to look at how more and more that there was just this overlap, much more so going to electric vehicle charging technology that we just didn't have with the traditional combustion vehicle. That was kind of what led to the formation of the Grid Connections podcast. But I mean, since then, I've just been passionate about it. I mean, hell, I even got certified to by Legacy EV out of Phoenix, Arizona, to work on electric car conversion. So I really always just approach the subject matter from like an engineering hands-on first approach, and then learn about the other technologies, and then how other sort of spheres, whether that be regulation or governments and other types of supporting stuff, kind of roll into it. Just because I feel like a lot of people may approach it from like a policy or other thing mentality first, and that's great, and that is needed. But you really, I think, to fully appreciate and how to have make our transportation go to a clean electric, you have to kind of understand the full picture. So that's a long-winded explanation of my background. And essentially, in COVID, people kind of knew I was just really passionate about this topic. And a couple of people reached out and like, Chase, you should just do a podcast on this topic and how all these connect. And I was like, and we were talking about this the other day. I just didn't want to be another guy with a podcast out of his basement. Well, that was like, I think week 2 or 3, because we all knew this COVID thing was going to be just a couple of weeks, then we'd be back to work. Well, by about month 3, I finally gave in and kicked off the GridConnections podcast. And it's really kind of focused on the intersection of electric transportation, energy generation, ideally renewable, and how our grid infrastructure, ideally with better software, ties all of these things together. So, I mean, it's a really amorphous and kind of large topic, but they are just so interwoven together. And from there, it's just been a really great way to not only leverage the network I had and stay in touch with people in the space, but even make new connections. Hell, actually, Cal Connor was one of just when he was kicking off out of Spec, I think in 2020, I think he was guest number, I want to say number 5, number 6. And so it's been great to see how out of Spec's grown. And since then, just leveraging all of the kind of interest and people who've come to, and I think some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today, that's where I recently kicked off Bespoke EVs Consulting, which focuses on bringing essentially really consumer first, especially education around electric vehicles and around electric vehicle infrastructure, from both the even electricity generation side for utilities to also auto OEMs and how to better position their electric vehicles to consumers. So apologies for that long-winded intro, Francie. So if you edit it down to 30 seconds, I won't blame you, but just kind of wanted to share a little bit of that background.
Yeah, thank you. No, I asked for it. And that is an interesting background. And it's always interesting for me to hear how folks have gotten interested in this space, because sometimes it's like lifelong passions turned electric as it's come around. Some people are fresh to it. So it's cool to hear, because everyone brings their unique perspective and their passions into the industry. So that's been fun. That's cool to hear about. And yeah, folks, today we're going to kind of be talking about the current state of the EV industry, because we're both pretty up to date with that. And on the EV, on this podcast, I talk about how it's EV and EV adjacent, which is something that you were talking about. This is all very interlinked. There's lots of connections from, renewable energies to the grid, to battery technologies, everyday drivers, experts. Like, there's so much to talk about, and it all starts to become full circle. I would love if we could get more and more and more full circle, really cradle to cradle, especially when it comes to considering the sustainability motivation. But yeah, we're working to get there. But yeah, the current state of EV charging infrastructure, like, why does it take so long to get DC fast chargers into the ground and up and running? And it's a lot more complicated than we want it to be, than sometimes people think it is. It's not as easy as just hooking it up and being able to charge. And like you were talking about, the approach from OEMs, because there are definitely different approaches to electric based on a lot of different things. There's like, I can think of like, well, just not really going electric, kind of being electric hesitant, to going for it, but, making some mistakes along the way, to just starting from the bottom up and building it. So a lot to talk about. And I'd love to start on, I'm going to give you another question, but from what you've been looking at, generally, like, where do you think we are for the state of EV infrastructure? Because it's not the brand new beginning, but it is definitely the beginning. And we're not totally blind. We're taking some of our lessons learned and moving forward. But like, where are we in the timeline, do you think?
For sure. That's such a great question. And I think we're going to be talking about a lot of different subjects and how they all tie together. And as we were even talking about before this could easily be a series of all how these different kind of minutia play together to make this happen. But I deep down, first, I'm an optimist. Sometimes I think people listening to my podcast might think I can be pessimistic, but I want to take a step back and just say, as that person who's been playing with EVs for like 2 decades now, it's crazy to see where we are with EV charging, because a decade ago, we weren't dealing with DC fast charging. I actually came across just the other day a few old photos of a Tesla supercharger. I think it was the first one that was opened in Oregon back in August of 2013. So back then, I think that was kind of like the true first wave of DC fast charging. Because before that, you were just happy to find a level 2 charger or a 240 outlet when you went on a road trip. It's gone from this very fringe kind of, and I think that's why had been so many jokes about like electric vehicle drivers for so long. And while I think people new to the EV space, it can be kind of annoying and frustrating. I know it's not happening overnight like a lot of us do want. And I even admit, like, I feel like, yeah, we've come so far in this past decade and the last few years. I really think we're kind of like in the third phase of DC fast charging. So let's say we go back to a year ago. I mean, there was Tesla was kind of obviously they've been around, and there were a couple others in the space, but most of them are either gone or have been acquired. And back then, most of them, if they were a high DC fast charging, they usually were anywhere from 50 to 100 kilowatts, if that. So Tesla was still definitely leading with kind of their version 1 around the 120 to then the V2 around 150 kilowatts. So that to me is like the phase 1, and it was still, it wasn't perfect, but I just want to kind of throw that as context, because a lot of what becomes kind of like, let's say the phase 2, like the Electrify America, the EV Go, that kind of really took off and started building kind of like the late 20 teens, or I don't know, do you say that 2010s, 20 teens, but like kind of around like 2018, 2019 was their first go at it. And even by that point, Tesla had been doing it for quite a few years. So I think a lot of EV drivers were just like, why isn't this working? And there's just still so many kind of hurdles that we're going to talk about today. But that to me was almost like the second phase of like, now you had non-Tesla cross-country DC fast chargers starting to come up in like 2018 through 2020. But then they start kind of facing some of the maintenance issues and other things that you and the rest of the Out of Spec team have really well documented. And now I kind of think we're in phase 3. And phase 2 was, even though obviously Electrify America was kind of the VW paying the bill for some of the things that they may have done that were frowned upon by the US government and others, that was kind of the first it was like them, EVgo, these new charge point operators coming in that weren't tied to a specific, as closely to a specific automaker like Tesla's platform had been. And they were acquiring some of the older level 2 and even kind of level 3 DC fast chargers. And I think a lot of the auto OEMs thought, okay, problem solved. We made our combustion vehicles for decades, and it was the Chevrons, the Texacos, all these different third-party oil companies kind of and gas companies took care of the actual fueling, and the day-to-day will be fine. Well, we've definitely found that hasn't been the case. And now I kind of think we're in the phase 3 of it, where it's been much more this past year. Mercedes-Benz, like you guys did a really great job of kind of showing their announcement here in North America. You have Ion and a lot of these much more OEM-backed DC fast chargers stepping in. I'm not sure if that's still going to be the answer or not. But it is really cool to see them now understanding that this is a large part of what needs to be solved, and that the EV experience moving forward is going to be a much more, it's kind of changed from product to platform. So you have to have you have to make the EV, you have to have the software layer to understand and how to do the route planning. And then you have to either through partnerships or pretty hands-on experience, have that fast charging and level 2 charging experience for the actual drivers as it moves forward, which creates new issues, but opens a lot of new doors.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for like kind of like a history lesson too.
Yeah.
And the
Please
approach
jump in,
back,
Francie. I hope I'm
no,
not ranting too much already, but
you are not.
this
No,
is the stuff I love talking
truly.
about.
And no, it's great. And it's interesting because it is becoming clearer and clearer that I think leaving, in terms of from an automaker's perspective, leaving it, aside from Tesla, leaving public charging up to other entities that were born out of different things. Like even EVgo was born out of like an energy company, NRG.
That's true.
You know, so, and it's a different perspective. They don't really have, EVgo, EA don't really have any skin in the game when it comes to vehicle sales. Like technically they need vehicles on the road to use their infrastructure, but I mean, yeah, they're not the ones selling them. So automakers stepping in and you're not going to sell EVs if there's not infrastructure. It also seems just a little bit, why didn't they see it before? A little. I mean, what do you think?
Hindsight's 2020, Francie. So I think there's a lot of, and I've talked to a lot of different OEMs that have said, oh, the best thing Tesla and Elon Musk ever did was build the supercharger network. But when they were doing that, they were pretty much laughed out of every room because, like, why would you build this thing? Why would you? It's going to be such a uh, it's going to be a large, it's going to be a capital expenditure, and then it's going to be a massive operating expenditure. And it's just like, this doesn't make sense. You let the market figure out what it'll be fine. These little electric vehicles, they're great little toys for the rich, or kind of like second vehicles for quirky people to have. But it just became clearer and clearer as the values and the advantages to electric transportation really caught on with vehicles, that more of these OEMs like, okay, yeah, there is actually a decent sized even uh, market for building electric vehicles. And now it's like, okay, I really do think a good portion of it. I mean, one of the things about Tesla and this, and we'll probably talk about this a little more in general, but the startups, and I think you can make the argument Tesla really isn't a startup, but they have definitely that startup consumer focus mentality that Tesla, Rivian, and I think Luce and a couple others have really been good at, is how do you make a consistent, great customer experience? And that is something from a lot of the software and tech world I've worked in, that while you have the great disruptors of and like the most successful companies usually is when you have an industry that hasn't been disrupted in a long time. You don't need one disruption, you need many. Like, the disruption has to be even greater than you just make an electric car. And I think with the automotive industry, it's one that there hadn't been any new entrants in a century. And it was, other than Ford, I mean, there were really the big three for a reason. And so Tesla not only came out with an electric user software defined electric vehicle, they also then had the hardware platform to have the supercharger. So there was just like everything that they were disrupting, I think, is also what kind of helped them become so successful, is that they had to have their own, call it gas stations. They had to have their own software. They had to have all of these other supporting things. And it made that disruption not only more powerful, but more successful. And for the OEMs that have been doing a lot of, I don't want to give the OEMs kind of that mentality that they just do the same thing over and over. But I think for a long time, the electric vehicle positioning, they didn't see it as needing to step in. And that's where Rivian early on, even with they have done their own Rivian Adventure Network, where they realize that's one other way you have a customer. It's a customer touch point and a customer experience you want to make sure is great. And for so many, you also have that kind of weird division between a traditional automaker and the dealership, and then the person who actually buys the vehicle and owns the vehicle. Whereas the startups have really been focused on not only making sure customer experiences and customer touch points are great, they're the ones that also own that experience. And that's why you're starting to see like the Mercedes and these others really finally, and some of it, frankly, is new management. Some of it is learning a little bit the hard way. But I think this is really, I think, to, like I said, I don't want to really bash the OEMs. They've definitely made some mistakes, but a lot of them are also making some pretty impressive, like either admitting they're wrong or even seeing where the startups have been successful and kind of even going the extra mile and realizing that, yeah, this is no longer something that they need to turf to another business. It actually is not, it's a thing that they need to take in, but also another way to make sure they stay a Hyundai or a Ford buyer when they go to buy that next vehicle. And then from the business side of it, there are additional revenue and other opportunities that kind of unlocks.
Totally the case, I think, is that if you want them to stick to even start by buying your electric vehicle, but think about, or maybe if they're going electric and they have a Ford or they already have some other car, that, okay, well, this company looks like they're kind of going Tesla's route, to start to invest in what the EV driver's experience is like. So I think you're hitting it right on the head. And it does also make sense that they would be hesitant. I think it's a new technology. That's just how we tend to react.
For sure. And it totally aligns with a lot of these, whether you want to call it psychographic, demographic, traditional buyers of some of these brands too. Obviously, you do have some of the luxury brands that kind of stepping into the electric realm first. There's been some kind of advantages for them, and they can kind of create those better experiences between not just route planning, but like Mercedes and the Porsche and Audi. Unfortunately, I want to see more here in the US, but like the ones they build in Germany and Europe, the charging facilities there are just amazing. What that is like, and it just takes like what the even gas station experience would be to like the whole nother, more like a whole nother level, more like when you go to airport and you can go into the lounge, and it just makes your trip a much better experience. And like even with Porsche, what they're and Audi, what they're doing with some of their charging and how they're approaching, I think we are seeing some really interesting things that aligns with what their brands have traditionally been known for, but efficiently and effectively electrified for this new generation of vehicle. And we're seeing other brands that are kind of struggling to identify who and what they want to be. I loved I actually listened to the podcast this morning that you did with Jordan about Toyota and kind of some of the challenges they've had with electrification, even though they were early in the hybridization of their vehicles.
Yeah, that's one that is a little bit of a point of contention amongst people, which is,
For
I mean, I
sure.
met someone who was like, "No, Toyota's approach is right because they're waiting to let the others do it, and then they're going to come in." But I'm like, Okay. I mean, I guess so, but also like, let's just do it. Why not? And if you're going to make one, don't make it so such a poor electric vehicle experience. Make a great golf cart or something if you're going to do that. But that is the BZ4X is not the
For
it's
sure.
not the road trip.
No, and I think you're totally right. I think they, as a manufacturer, not only have they made some amazing vehicles over the years, big Land Cruiser fan here, but they have done a lot for manufacturing. They've done a lot of these things where they've just not only led, but like they just own that space. They're so good at it.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that has not always led them to be, even though they kind of did something innovative by doing the Prius and the hybridization, there's an
Yeah.
element where they've really kind of entrenched themselves. And I think some of that may be cultural from a company standpoint, among other things. But I disagree with what you bring up. And I know you're not saying it, but like when people bring up that idea, it's like, oh, Toyota's just waiting. And I think more that's actually their marketing to say what they're doing. Because, yeah, you can make the argument all day that obviously Tesla's kind of taking the first mover approach. And kind of the ironic thing is a lot of people compare them to Apple. And Apple is always known for coming out with, and in some ways, now that Tesla's matured, they actually have become this way. But the one area traditionally where Tesla has been different from Apple is like they're not a first mover in a lot of these realms. They're actually a second mover. And they will, and I think obviously Tesla kind of led with electric vehicles and a lot of the software and stuff they're doing. But now you look at some of the things like when they put a heat pump in their cars, they weren't the first to do it, but they did do it at kind of like that Apple, like, no, we're going to crank it to 11. We're going to make sure the engineering and all this is very dialed in and done well and show how the rest of the industry to do it. And it's kind of like the iPhone, honestly. They were not the first company to make a smartphone, but they showed how to make a smartphone that everyone wants and is actually usable. And they combined a lot of technologies like touchscreen and all this stuff that's been around for ages. And I know probably a lot of your user or listeners are probably aware of this, but it's really interesting to look at Tesla. We can use it for a lot of the examples as them as a first mover in automotive. But honestly, there's the second mover. And I think that's where Porsche has done amazing. I think you can now even make the argument that's a little bit of what Rivian's been doing with some of their stuff. But in no way would I say being the second mover, which in the business sense usually means you kind of look at the market, wait to see where it is, and then strike. I really have not seen that from Toyota from the electric vehicle side. I've seen them make some really interesting, cool products lately in general, but
Mhm.
I'm still, I think we're in agreement on the electric vehicle front.
Yeah, I agree. I think a second mover in this example is a close second, not a farther,
It might be
tenth
yeah,
mover.
it's a last place.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk a little bit about charging infrastructure. So I'm actually going to bring up a map for those that are tuning in on YouTube because the energy, oh my gosh, what is this? The U.S. Department of Energy has a map. This is, you can go on PlugShare too, but when we look at it, you can look at level 1, which is the really slow, like trickle charging. Level 2, a little bit faster, more of that at work, at home charging, and then DC fast charging. And as you're watching me populate this map with more and more points, we're seeing that the US technically has a really good coverage of EV charging right now. I think most of the negative news in the past year, 2 years or so was largely due to the lack of reliability, to the lack of proper maintenance of public EV charging sites that led to nightmares along road trips, or if people solely rely on public EV charging. And I think a lot of that there's a lot of pressure on these companies, these charge point operators, to address this, but it has left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. So there's this huge focus now on DC fast charging, and if we look at the numbers, there's over 120,000 public level 1 chargers. There's about 550,000 public level 2 chargers, and then around 35,000 public DC fast charging stations. So they're the lower proportion of the public charging out there. They're very important, of course. They're significant in being able to get around, quick charge, road trips, all that stuff. But there is a huge, and I'm wondering if you think it is a disproportionate attention on DC fast charging in this industry. Because I do hear a little bit, that folks are saying, okay, well, maybe we have enough DC fast chargers. They're just not reliable enough. But what about the at-home charging? What about the workplace charging? What do you think?
For sure, that's a great question. That's something I'm actually hearing a lot as well. So it's kind of funny you're hearing that too. I disagree that we have enough DC fast charging, but inherently, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about earlier. The great thing about electric vehicles is you are your own gas station. If you can set that up or kind of have that at your own home or where you live. And yeah, you're right. 80% of charging, I believe it's roughly 80%, is done by level 2 or level 1 charging at home. And I think that'll come down as more and more cars become affordable, and you got people living in multifamily and all these other things where it's a little bit more difficult maybe to have charging where they live. But whether it's at work or on street charging options, it's still going to be by far the majority of charging is going to be done by level 1 and level 2. And to be honest with you, that is actually really easy to implement because especially level 1 is really just a wall outlet. The regulation and what that looks like for actually implementing that level of charging, and even level 2 AC, is really simple and straightforward in a lot of ways. Because for the most part, I think there's some really cool things. This is where I'm really nerding out. Is like in the actual panels at your house. There's so many cool, really like software and kind of they call them smart panel technology that's taking off that I think is going to make a big difference, not just for EVs, but a lot of stuff. But traditionally, that's been just a panel. And so AC charging on a panel for an EV pretty much looks the same like a lot of other appliances. It's really, maybe it's more like a dryer. It's a larger energy need for an appliance, but it's a really simple and pretty straightforward thing. Now, admittedly, there are still things to be aware of, and Todd Malogny on State of Charge does a fantastic job of showing which level 2 chargers are not worth doing and why it is extremely important to make sure you have the proper electrician to install this at your house. But so much of it really is pretty straightforward as to what, and especially by now, because I think most electricians have seen that. And some even communities have required that as kind of building ordinance, whether it's for solar or these, that they have a lot of the wiring and stuff kind of all ready to go. So I think from the AC level, the level 1, level 2s, one, it's fantastic. That's where I do the majority of my driving. I even pull it up. I got some funny little thing in my Tesla app the other day that's like, you have had your car for 2 years. And I was like, oh, I wasn't really paying attention. And I'd already put 53,000 miles on it. And a lot of that was supercharging, probably much more so than the average person, but still about, I think 75% was still, believe it or not, level 2 charging. And I really do think that that is the area that needs to still have some pretty big growth, but is a pretty straightforward future and easy to implement. And there's a lot of programs for that to help make that easier for some of these multifamily homes and workplace charging, like we're talking about. It's really once you start getting the DC fast charging that now you're also dealing with direct current, but you're starting to deal with much larger numbers and things that requires kind of a step up, not in just regulation, but hardware, software, and all these other things that kind of increase the price. And yes, it's not the majority of the time, but it still has a very big purpose to serve. And like I was kind of talking about Tesla earlier, they've been around for a decade now. So they have a lot of great data on kind of that first mover and seeing where and how to be proactive to make sure that their chargers are reliable and work. But at the same time, I do I-80 a lot when I do road trips. And going through Wyoming, and I was just seeing someone, and I know some of your team even had issues with it because there's a lot of V2 superchargers on I-80, and they, for the most part, still work, but there is a decent, and once again, that works for some of the older Teslas. It doesn't work going to what they're kind of doing with the North American charging standard to make sure other EVs can not only use it, but higher speeds and all these things that we still really need to see. And that is kind of the downside then of being the first mover is you have a lot of this kind of vestigial and older technology laying out that you have to make sure stays updated and put the cost into make sure it's updated to the latest thing. And I'd love to see a lot of those become kind of these V4 charging stations that they've talked about. But that is really, I think there's a lot of work for not only there to be more DC sites, but the ones that are out there need to be updated as well.
I agree that retrofitting sounds like a headache for all of the kind of the first movers or the folks who put in the first hardware, like EVgo with their like Delta 50 kilowatt chargers at shopping malls that are, probably very useful for some people, but yeah, definitely a headache to retrofit and keep up with how we're moving. So I hear about future proofing all the time. And so I really am curious whenever, I'm talking to a hardware maker and they're like, this is how we're future proofing. I'm like, okay, let's try to think through all the scenarios. Is this really future proofing? Because I would love to see it. And you're talking about, so we need to put in more DC fast charging stations. And a question that I've been wanting to pose to more and more people is, in my little, dream world, we're starting kind of from the beginning. We get to kind of recreate this way of transportation. Sure, same roads, basically a car, but these stops are inherently, by the nature of EV charging, longer stops. And you could just sit in your car after you're walking into the convenience store and getting a snack. But when you think of the perfect DC fast charging station or level 2, whatever, I think there should be diversity at a lot of these
for sure
charging stations. But what do you picture as the amenities that are necessary to have the best experience? And you can be a dreamer here also.
Well, I think every Dave and Buster. No, I'm just kidding. I think honestly, like hotels are always the big one for level 2. I think, because that's honestly, and I think one, it's really cool to see how many hotel chains have actually announced they're installing level 2 and doing partnerships with all these companies. So I think that actually is going to change pretty significantly. But definitely that also kind of goes, and I think that really actually does go to what you're talking about for future planning, because there's quite a few hotels I've been to where they have 1 or 2, and it was kind of the exotic thing for them for a long time to even have one.
Yeah.
But then you get the Wyomings and some of these kind of charging deserts, and now you might show up and there might be a few other EVs there, even though it used to be such an easy thing. And so you want to make sure that you're designing kind of these to add more. I realize there's definitely an additional cost, but spending a little bit more upfront to future proof can go a long ways. Now, completely the same with DC fast charging. I think what's funny is future proofing for DC fast charging. I think for a long time, until just recently, people even knew what future proofing looked like for DC fast charging. I think a lot of people thought like anything above 200 kilowatts was going to be extreme. But going back to your question around what the ideal situation looks like, I think personally, I'm more in the Kyle Connor camp of when I do road trips. I usually go from Bend, Oregon to Phoenix, Arizona fairly regularly. I haven't done it actually for a little while, but that's about a 1,200-mile trip, and I do that in a day. And I'd usually break that into about 8 charging stops, and each of those would be pretty short stops. Usually 15 minutes, if not closer, like 10 minutes, really just use the bathroom, do whatever, and kind of get what I need to go on the road for another 2 hours or so. And the thing that usually takes the longest time is, especially when I'm doing that trip, I'm going through parts of Nevada that also have a lot of older V2 charging stations. So those are the ones that kind of slow me down. So I think in some ways, what my ideal charging thing looks like is just faster, higher powered charging stations for the DC fast charging. And that's one of the things when people talk about who or what the next phase, as we kind of like the 3 phases of fast charging. the current and maybe future phase, and I think honestly longer term, I shouldn't say only, but I think the clearest path to a lot of DC fast charging companies being financially stable are looking at a lot of these traditional gas and large chain operators of the world. Like you have Bucky's and some of these others that are kind of partnering either with Tesla or Mercedes to do a station at one of their locations. But now you've got Flying J and Pilot kind of partnering with GM Energy and others to install installations there. And this is kind of a fun automotive fact that if people who listen to this, I definitely recommend if you're interested, also just kind of getting like a more Detroit or like traditional automotive experience. John McElroy of Autoline is always a very good kind of person to share what is kind of a good, doing a bad job of describing this, but a good realistic understanding of a market when it comes to automotive. And with fueling, traditionally they don't make money on gas. They make money on hot dogs. They make money when you go in and use all these other things. And so a lot of these charging companies, I think Tesla has kind of gotten into it where they've gone pretty it's not impossible, but I mean, like I said, they've been around for a decade. It's taken them a while to get this capital efficient. But with some of these other charging organizations, I just don't, or CPOs, I don't really think that they're in a position to be competitive because now you're starting to see some of these charge 60 cents or even more per kilowatt hour and making it just as expensive and not more for gas, especially if you're driving a EV truck. And so I definitely think the future of it probably will be more like not there. There's revenue from EV charging, but the margins and profit come from the traditional upsells that people use when they go to a gas station. And with what we've been seeing, when you talk about future proofing up fast DC fast charging and how much that's been growing, I really do think it's going at that point where we're going to see more of the 10 to 15 minute stops. And even in the current situation with our dailies a Model Y, even when I do a road trip with my wife and the dogs, they're usually, I'm usually waiting on them before instead of the car. The car is usually ready before they are on a lot of these road trips. It's usually only when it's me. And even just talking to so many like skeptics or detractors, the Kyle Connors, the Brandon Flashes, even myself, so the world, we're kind of a rare bunch. Very rarely do people ever do road trips over even a few hundred miles, let alone close to 1,000, let alone in a couple days, let alone a day like we
Mhm.
do. And so like a lot of these people will find these issues and say, oh, I can do it faster while driving with in my gas car. And I do actually have our weekend vehicle is a 1987 Land Rover Defender 90 that I'm slowly restoring. I'm planning to make electric anyway. But yeah, most of the time, especially if you're road tripping with a family, the family is going to take way longer than the car does, even in the current state. And with what we're seeing between not just battery technology, but also the EVs hitting the market and more of these higher powered fast charging stations, I think longer term, it's just going to evolve into kind of what we're seeing already with the traditional fueling experience on a road trip. It's really just
Mhm.
making sure that there's more plentiful level twos at kind of hotels, especially. I would love to see more stuff for at work locations for people
Yeah.
who kind of go to, and like any large car park for a lot of these things, or airports are definitely the big ones that you're seeing some there, but I think still need to be kind of cranked up in the implementation.
100%. Yeah, I think the pressure should be on DC fast charging, but also level 2
Oh, for
charging.
sure. It's not a. I don't think it's a this or that. I think
Yeah,
it's definitely
exactly.
a both.
Yeah, and I was talking to, I can't remember who it was, but I think I've talked about it a couple times, but how real estate is going to be tied into the electrification just generally, whether it's like actually putting in lines or having the ability to have EV charging, at least having the power on site, but how that's going to come into how we value real estate and,
For
also
sure.
regulation and building multi-unit housing or stuff like that, which is pretty cool to think about.
Yeah, I mean, there's I mean, do we kind of want to focus on answering that question, like why does it take so long for DC fast
Yeah,
charging
let's
to
do
go on the
it.
ground? We're only,
Yeah.
let's see, 40 minutes into this conversation. Now we're finally getting to this specifically. Well, I mean, I kind of look at there's kind of four realms that I think have to be taken into account. One is the utilities themselves. The next
Mhm.
is OEMs. And then the third is regulations and regulators. And then the
Mhm.
fourth is really the charge point operators themselves. And Like I said, this could easily be a series breaking each one of these down. But at a high level, and this kind of goes back to that episode you were talking about with Kevin around kind of the challenges that utilities are facing because around resource management. And there is still a big issue around actual supply chain for transformers and other supporting things. And I think one of the other areas, like for all the attention, all the talk that people are having about electric vehicles and electric heat pumps and all these things are going to bring down the grid, that is such a small fragment and a slow additional energy being put onto the grid as a stressor in comparison to data centers and all these next generation of AI and Bitcoin mining, God forbid, that's a whole nother energy user that are actually having much larger drains and kind of testing the grid in much more difficult ways. And so as a utility and a regulator, but especially utility, that is where you're kind of having to juggle, where am I putting a transformer? Is it going to go to the next Google data center? Is it going to go this location? How long has been X company waiting for, I guess I mean that as variable, not Twitter. X company is waiting for a transformer or other supporting infrastructure. And there is really a big issue with that. And then from the regulator standpoint, I think there's a lot of good work being done, but that's what's guiding a lot of these utilities. And there's the full spectrum. Obviously, you've got the federal side where you've got everything from FERC and NERC and all these fun other acronyms having influence on utilities and the electrical grid. And then you have obviously the breakdown between ERCOT and the West Coast and East Coast grids themselves. But getting, I think, more to it is where you're seeing kind of the big differentiations in rollout is on the state level. Obviously, you have the public utility commissions that are kind of determining to what level and what speed a state has to roll out some of their mandates. And once again, we're not just talking about electric vehicles. We're talking about decarbonization of the grid. We're talking about resiliency. We're talking about all these different things that electric vehicles are one part of. And there's also then the flip side to those coins, where you have a lot of the CUBs, the citizen utility boards of the world, who do amazing things. They're focused on making sure that ratepayers are paying the least and having the most resilient energy. And sometimes that does kind of push back some of these projects and implementations because it could have a negative financial impact to ratepayers, and it does slow down some of these things. And so there's unfortunately no like silver bullet to help speed up DC fast charging. But there are ways. There are kind of like the little, a bunch of small things make a big impact. And so whether that be from public utility commissions that kind of minimize the permitting and have really straightforward ways to implement new fast charging, that's huge. When you have a utility that have their own mandates from investors to either decarbonize and or install more electric vehicle charging, that obviously has a big impact. And then you have the charge point operators and the automotive OEMs themselves. And so the charge point operator, are they building for the future? Are they putting in these massive Alpitronic DC fast chargers? Or are they kind of just putting in the 50 kilowatt things of the past? Do you have, I mean, once again, I have plenty of people on my podcast that love the Chevy Bolt, but it charges at 50 kilowatts. Like, you have to have these. I want to see more of the Porsche stuff trickle down, where you have just these monster charge things that will kind of bring down charge times and all these other things that really get rid of a lot of the concerns that people have around EV fast charging. And then you also have to have the sometimes for these sites, the large batteries to help make these DC fast charging sites much more profitable and consistent due to grid instability and additional charges from the grid. Did I jump around to enough places to describe why this is so complicated?
Yeah, exactly. It is so complicated. There are so many different connections and links and different motivations. And I think utilities are often painted as kind of the bad guy, slowing things down, stuck in their old ways, not modernizing quickly enough. But then I get the perspective of folks who work with utilities, and they're like, well, they're working with what they got, and so I think we're also figuring out like who makes these big decisions, even as high up as it can go, to make sure that this kind of process can happen as quickly as possible. And one thing that you had kind kind of noted before was about NEVI unintentionally
Yeah.
perhaps slowing DC fast charging rollouts. And I would love for you to expand on that, because when you hear of NEVI, which is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, it's all about states getting federal funding to roll out DC fast charging stations. How could that possibly slow things down?
Yeah, no, I mean, God, this is unfortunate, and this is kind of like, once again, it's the what is it? The path to hell is paved with good, or the highway to hell is paved with good intentions, and I think that that isn't as much of an issue as it was, but there are a lot of these charge point operators. Like I said, there's high installation costs. They are working with very tight margins, and so while they were making a lot of calculated decisions and partnerships as to where they were going to put these DC's fast chargers, there was also a need, like, okay, once this NEVI money became available, it's like, well, this is a site that could be, it's going to be heavy traffic either way, but if it saves us a couple million or a few hundred thousand, the margins and the ROI changes dramatically. And so if we just have to wait another 6 months to a year, but we get that NEVI funds, then it makes our ROI drop down significantly. And so it has unfortunately sometimes incentivized some of the CPOs to hold out on some of these installations. Someone who I have on my podcast pretty regularly is Lauren McDonald of EV Adoption, evadoption.com, and he is the wizard, the king of like tracking which state. And this is kind of where we also get into some of this unfortunate issues also with NEVI, is the fact that it's state by state. And so, yeah, you do have some states that are leading, but then you get the Wyomings and some of these other states that may be taking a while due to political reasons intentionally, and sometimes due to
Mhm.
maybe just bureaucracy. That
Mhm.
means they haven't announced anything, or they're being kind of slow to announce how that's going to roll out. So, um, that I think that was kind of the unfortunate thing, where there were some states that we have seen unintentionally slow down things that were going to open, and just because they decide to wait for the state fund or the federal funds allocated by the state, they slow down a bit. There are also, I think this is changing because some people are starting to realize that, one, it's not a given, and some of these states are taking so long to even and it's kind of a wild thing, because there's different, each rollout of the NEVI funds at each state has their own rollout phase. There's a couple states that are already on to like the second or third one. There's other states who have not even done the basic paperwork and all this stuff. So that, unfortunately, I think is changing. But there are these things that just came unintentionally, well intentioned, slowing stuff down.
Yeah, that is unfortunate to hear, but it does make sense when you lay it out. And I've talked to folks who are like, well, we didn't qualify for this round of NEVI funding, so we could
Right.
build the site, but we're going to wait for the next one so that we get the funding. Of course, makes sense. And also, yeah, we're left waiting sometimes, which
Yeah.
is.
Well, and it's funny you mention that, because like JT from Franklin's Charging, who you guys have had on your podcast and talked to, and you even got to go to the location. I had him on my podcast as well, and it was interesting because he even talked about it as kind of a smaller operation, because he has, I believe, 2 locations now. He was trying to get some of the NEVI funding, and I think they might be able to get something going with another phase, but it requires a lot of money and work to get the proposal and all this stuff ready too. So there's just kind of I think it is definitely a net benefit, but it's not always a clear and immediate return. And once again, I want to stay optimistic. Like I said, as someone who's been kind of watching this for so long now, sure, it's delayed by 6 months to a year, but in the grander scheme of things, it's all happening. It's all working. Reliability is slowly going up for some providers, and we're getting
Mhm.
more on the ground. So it is going
Mhm.
the right way. Obviously, from the hardware side, COVID did have some long tail and unaffected or unfortunate supply chain impacts, and
Mhm.
that is definitely still hurting. I mean, the more companies can kind of do what Tesla's doing with their super, it is not by any means a panacea for like curing all of the ills, but the fact that they really have got into, with a lot of their supercharger locations, of kind of making it in a I'm drawing a blank, but in a process where do it all offsite in a factory. They essentially make it into a
Prefab.
product prefab. Yeah. assembly line. That's what I was trying to have, an assembly
Ah,
line approach to building these at scale. Not that that is the not that the way that others are doing won't work, but that is just one other way to kind of speed up and get a better margins.
hmm. Yeah, I feel like there's a couple different factors that are coming into play to
Couple
help.
thousand, couple
Yeah,
thousand.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. A ton of moving parts. And people,
Yeah,
sometimes people generally when I tell them what I do, they're like, "Oh, how are EVs doing?" And I'm like, we're still growing. I mean,
for sure.
we're like year over year growth of like 20%. There's over 2 point or around 2.5 million EVs on the roads today, and there's more and more options, more and more competitive because also a question I get is who else is there besides Tesla? Who else can I
Right.
drive besides Tesla? And I'm like, well, luckily there's more and more options. We'd love to see the great technology there, and I love seeing the software
Oh, that's a huge
oriented
layer to
EVs
it.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
I
and
mean, and that's what's so cool about, and one of the things we talk about too is software actually does bring down your total number of chargers needed by instead of working reactively, how do you make it proactive? How do you do some of the stuff like Tesla and other companies are doing now to actually talk with the site, figure out which one is live, and so you direct someone to a different charger location, or proactively
yeah.
think, well, there's already these other cars going to it. It's going to be maxed out. You've got the range. Go the next one. Go the next one. And so there is some really cool stuff that just has not been possible with the combustion world. And I know you're totally right. People are always asking like, what is the state of EVs? And it is the one thing that does not get enough attention is at how not how fast, how many more EVs are being put on the market, but at how fast the technology is improving. And I think a lot of people think of that from the battery density and energy density standpoint. That's to some part true, but not, it's just across the board. It's the manufacturing and the margins of building the EV. It's the manufacturing, it's the margins of the battery pack. It's that software layer that you just would never have with a combustion vehicle talking to. I mean, it would be a great feature if I had a combustion vehicle, instead of going to the Costco that's got a 30-minute wait but is really cheap gas, it would send me to something on the other side that would be maybe a little bit farther drive but equally cheap, and I don't have a 30-minute wait. And I think one of the other there's a lot of narrative, there's a lot of misperception, sometimes intentionally negative. But I do just want to remind listeners, and maybe this is part of the reason I'm so optimistic. Like, so much of this is not, you kind of have to assume, positive intent. When I used to work with Apple, that's like one of the biggest things I always took away in my professional career. And it's so true with the EV space. Why is the EV DC fast charger taking so long? Well, you got to assume positive intent. It's majority of it isn't anything bad. It's just like the Nevi things of the world. These little things that are kind of like two steps forward, one step back. And we're also seeing that with electric vehicles themselves, but just across the board, the software that's just like taking that experience to a whole nother level. The Chinese car companies, the startups, are just excelling in this realm to really minimize how long. And there's so many great stats too that, unfortunately, the narrative has kind of implanted in a lot of people's minds that when there's been research done and with how common like level 2 charging is, for a lot of people in an average year, they spend less time charging an EV than they do waiting at a gas station or going to a gas station to fill up on gas. And it's those kinds of things that
Mhm,
just don't seem true, or so naturally unintuitive that,
mhm,
but are fact, that you do
mhm,
just have to have. And these are the conversations I'm having all the time, not just on my podcast, but day to day with clients, and also people just on the streets. And I always find this stuff interesting because, like,
mhm,
I guess I have naturally a bit of a debate background, but I don't want to come off as smug or like talk down to people. Most of it is just education. Once again, assuming positive intent, where they just haven't heard the other side of it, haven't had that exposure, and that's why the startups again have done really well, and the OEM legacy automakers have kind of struggled, where it's just getting butts and seats and having that experience as to expand why going EV is a change, but a big improvement.
mhm,
Whereas sometimes, no fault to the dealership, they just maybe don't have that education, and there's also
mhm,
complications in the EV sale that
mhm.
have made it harder for people to be exposed to that. But when someone gets in an EV and drives around, they start seeing all the benefits and experiencing it firsthand.
Totally. I think you hit on so many points that so many thoughts come up. Hopefully, I
I'm
can
telling you
remember
this.
them all.
I
But it
if it's
sounds
either my
great.
podcast or yours, we need to have like almost a weekly series.
I
Sometimes
know that would be
I'm
great.
really enjoying what I enjoy about your podcast and just even having this. It's just like there's so many of these things that
Yeah.
our weekly episodes are one usually about an hour long, and they'll get really detailed. But
Yeah.
there's so many things that can be expanded out and other facts that are still so much fun to talk about and just go over.
Yeah, that would be fun to like maybe, let's talk about what happened this
Yeah.
week.
No, I mean
'Cause
exactly that alone.
yeah, and part of my motivation also in working in this space is just the fact that for some reason it's become polarizing to a lot of
For
people,
sure.
electric vehicles. And I am like, okay, I see why maybe this happened, but let's talk about it. And I have
For
been
sure.
some of my favorite people to talk to are people who don't know anything about EVs really, because they have wonderful questions and they're curious to
Yeah.
learn and they're wondering like, is Tesla really that bad? Or like, is Tesla really that good? And just to be able to deliver facts to folks so that they can form their own opinions about this whole industry and gain insight into this, you know, pretty magnificent in terms of its impact on like the human world, our transportation systems and how people get around and all the impact like we've talked about on our grid and our energy and where it's coming from and where it's going and how we're building our homes and designing the world around us. It's so much potential to share information, and that's what I find so fun is like, let me just give you the facts and see what you think. And it's sometimes a bit clearer than maybe it's gotten mixed up to be
Oh, for
sometimes.
sure. And in some ways, inherently good or bad, it is much more difficult and mixed up because, like we've talked
Mhm.
about, it's more of a platform than a product. It's not the
Mhm.
traditional combustion vehicle you've had for a century. It's the EV that you can charge at home, or you can throw
Yeah.
solar and be like completely off grid, and all these fun things that this kind of lifestyle, these products now unlock and allow for people to have exposure to.
Yeah, never have to go to a gas station. Some people have been like, oh my God, yeah, that would be great." Or, you could lease it now. There's these crazy lease
For
deals
sure.
because the technology is advancing. And then 2 or 3 years later, then you can decide maybe if you want to buy then. But there's a lot of opportunities that, as you kind of mentioned, dealerships and OEMs are struggling to make that impact on consumers and get through the everyone latches onto a headline and then it infiltrates your opinions, of course, but we love to get into the details. But I think that's also because sometimes where we come in, we're like, okay, well, if the dealers can't tell you about it, let's see if we can help you understand this. But I would love to see them step up to it. I
For sure.
Yeah.
I know that was something we want to talk about today, but we're coming up on an hour. Do we want to continue or?
We can. I mean,
Okay.
if unless or we could also, table it and come back for other episodes, whatever you think.
Yeah. Why don't we? Let's just go over it real quick at a high level, and we could definitely table it more in depth for a whole nother episode. But yeah, I mean, exactly what we've been talking about when it comes to EV education and EV charging experience. For legacy auto OEMs, good or bad, dealerships play a huge factor in that. And there are some dealerships that are seeing the potential there, and some of that's regionality for the actual market to buy EVs where it makes sense more in more urban areas or stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I've had quite a few experience with dealerships where there's multiple challenges that are kind of working against. It's not even the dealership between the OEM, it's the dealership between their salespeople and the customer, and those sorts of incentives, not only just for EVs, but the actual incentives for the salespeople. So, a big one is just the fact that I think, once again, like because Tesla has kind of owns all their stuff vertically integrated so well, they own not only the messaging, but they kind of go out of their way to make sure that their products, now that they've gotten to the size, are maximized for uh, different incentives in different markets. So now they're really their vehicles hadn't qualified for a long time for the federal tax credit. Now I think, other than like the entry cars, pretty much all of their vehicles, a lot of their vehicles do, and that does change. But there are, talking about regulations, there are so many things that go into the battery materials, where the car's made, and all these things that are also really complicated for a salesperson to know, and kind of gives the leg up to the startups where all you have to talk about is EVs. You don't have to talk about this compared to an F-150. And then speaking of the F-150 Lightning, well, it doesn't get the full 7,500. It gets 3,750 because of this battery pack and where it's from. And understandably, I mean, once again, kind of assuming positive intent, I have a lot of sympathy for dealership salespeople because it is pretty cutthroat. It's extremely high turnover, and you just need to move metal at the end of the day. And the sales process for someone coming into the dealership when they have maybe an idea of what they want to buy and trying to sell an EV is still a pretty big uphill battle. You got to explain home charging, you got to explain DC fast charging, you have to explain the incentives and why one vehicle might only get 3,750 or a part of that and another gets 7,500. And if you're also just working with one or multiple brands, that just makes the conversation that much more complicated. So um, I do work with a lot of dealerships to kind of help them with education and positioning of this and what to focus on and some dealerships even see them, they'll bring up the incentive thing, but that's like the last thing they bring up. They really focus on like where there's really the right questions to ask is what kind of driving do you do? How far do you usually go? What are you trying to do with this car? If it's just an errand getter, yeah, and you own your own house, yeah, you should probably go with an EV. If not, here's a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid, something to think about. And there's just so much of the client facing and positioning and having that empathy to understand the buyer's intentions and needs to align them with the right vehicle. And I'll be the first to admit, not an electric vehicle is for everyone right now, but electric vehicles are for a lot more people than a lot of people realize. And that's changing and improving every day.
Yeah, that's the key right there, is that a lot of people could live very happily with an electric vehicle if they
For sure.
gave it the chance. But if you tow coast to coast every day, I'm not going to tell you to get an electric truck. Probably, I think you might have a headache here or there. But yeah, we obviously covered a lot today. I mean, I think it's very fun because we both have an interesting background. You have an interesting background speaking to, not only your actual experience, but what you talk about over on GridConnections. So I would also love to know like what our listeners found interesting, because like you
For
said,
sure.
could be
Yeah.
could be a series. And if y'all would like us to dive into certain topics in the future with Chase, that would be awesome. And also Chase would love to come on GridConnections,
Yeah,
or
I guess we might as well reveal it now. You'll be on the GridConnections podcast as well. This episode will probably go live before our episode does on GridConnections, but we'll for sure link that as soon as it's available. Have really enjoyed
definitely.
this conversation, and yes, please share your thoughts. Even disagree with us in the comments,
Yeah,
and give us ideas
always.
for other topics to discuss or areas where
Mhm.
there's questions or like I said, we really still have only scratched the surface as to why this takes so long. But I
Yeah.
hope this was informative to everyone listening. And just want to say thanks again to Spec and you too as well, Francie.
Hey, thanks so much, Chase. Yeah, we talked about why, automakers should be moving into EV charging, and they are, how EV sales are not lower than we're still selling EVs. There's still
Oh
people
yeah,
adopting
it's
them.
still
There's
growing.
still growing. A lot to look
And
forward to.
no, and I mean, we have so many guests come on that just highlighted like sales have slowed down, but it's still a positive. And if you look at everything in the automotive industry, it's still every brand is exciting. I mean, the majority of the sales slowdown has been due to Tesla, but they're still selling a lot of EVs. It's still a lot of great stuff to be excited about. And it's still a part of this automotive market that is only growing and a positive acceleration. So these we'll be busy in our podcast, each of us for quite a while with these
Yeah,
topics.
I love it. Yeah, it's so dynamic. It's constantly evolving. It can even be dramatic at times. And I want to wrap up with one question, because I know
Oh,
you,
yeah.
yeah, if you could have any electric vehicle right now, what would it be?
That changes daily. I
Today,
am
what
really,
are you
yeah.
feeling?
Well, most of it's I'm watching Kyle like drive something and I was like, oh, I gotta try that.
Yeah.
Which that's a whole nother thing. But um, yeah, I think just one. Oh, I don't know
Or
if I
if
can do
you
that,
want,
Francie. I think I need
okay.
a
Give me your,
fun one and like maybe a utilitarian one.
there you go.
Um, Fun one. Ooh, I can't even choose that right now. I think if there's no budget, probably the new Porsche Taycan. That is
Yeah.
sweet. If
Yeah.
there's
Agreed.
some financial responsibility, I would say the new Performance Model 3. Just when you
Mm.
look at kind of like the spider graph of everything it does, it's just an awesome package and super comfortable, super reliable, super fun. And then for the more utilitarian thing, I would say, because it's going to be a truck. This might be controversial. I actually am a fan of the Cybertruck a little bit. And I grew up on a farm, so I can say actually what truck stuff is and what truck stuff isn't. And I grew up in a rural area, and you can do all this crap with a Cybertruck, but it's probably between that. It's either between a Cybertruck or I'd have to get in that new Silverado EV to see what's between those two. I think from a day-to-day tech everything standpoint, it probably goes to Cybertruck. But for towing and some other things, I still do fairly regularly. Until that battery gets bigger, it might be the Chevy. So I did a really good job of kind of not answering your question.
That's okay. I love when people do that. I like it. I like your choices. I want to know what our listeners, I haven't really posed that a lot, but yeah, y'all, if you could choose your top, I guess, 3 EVs
for sure,
or one, what would it be? Would love to know. And like we said, let us know what you would like Chase and I to dive into the future. We can do our research and come back with stuff as well. And definitely check out his work at GridConnections.
Thank you.
And follow him on Twitter. We'll have all the links below to like all of your stuff. Check him out. He's very knowledgeable, and I think you deliver everything very well. So also great work, and I appreciate you coming onto the podcast and lending your time and energy today.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it, and can't wait to have you on our podcast and have that go live soon. So thanks again, Francie, and the whole Autospec team for having me on today.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in for another episode of the Autospec podcast. Drive safe, stay charged. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.